Welcome to the campus of North Idaho College and today's broadcast of the North Idaho College Public Forum. The crew is comprised of North Idaho College television students. Your moderator is North Idaho College political scientist Tony Stewart.
Ladies and gentlemen, today we wish to start a 6-week series with you on a subject that is revolutionary in the field of medicine. We're going to be talking about DNA research, and particularly we're going to address some of the questions in relation to genetic engineering. On these 6 programs, we have 3 experts that have been visiting our campus to speak to the student body and are going to share their comments and ideas with you. When we deal with DNA research and recombinant DNA in particular, it is a process of taking genes from one organism and splicing them into the genes of another. Out of this system, we have created some very, very important questions about the future of our society and people in particular. In fact, I'd like to make the comment that we're going to be able to design people in the future, and society, meaning you, is going to have to take a hard look and make some decisions about what ought to be done. In order to deal with something that is of just paramount importance, we're going to have our programs for the next 6 weeks in 3 sections. The first 2 weeks we're going to talk about the ethical questions in genetic engineering in particular, what should and should not be done. We will be addressing such issues as test tube babies, human cloning, prenatal diagnosis, and we're also going to talk about controlling human diseases. I'm very happy to welcome to our program someone who's been dealing with this throughout the United States and even other countries, and he shall discuss this today and next week. Our guest today is Mr. Bruce Hilton. He is the director of the National Center for Bioethics in San Francisco. He is also the publisher of the Bioethics Letter. As to educational background, he holds a baccalaureate degree from Indiana Central University, and he holds a master's in divinity from the United Theological Seminary. He has done some other things that will certainly classify him as an expert. He was the keynote speaker at the World Conference on Human Rights and New Biology that was held in Switzerland. He also went to London to consult with Dr. R.G. Edwards, who is the godfather of the first test tube baby. His credentials are very long, but we want to get into the program, and I think that we have established his credibility. Mr. Hilton, welcome to our program.
Thank you, Tony.
Joining with me this week and next week in questioning our guests on ethical questions of genetic engineering, I would like to welcome to the panel Richard Snyder, a faculty member at North Idaho College in the field of anthropology, Bob Mary, who's also in our faculty in the biological sciences, and we're happy to have with us Father Bill Wasmuth, who is with St. Pius Catholic Church in Coeur d'Alene. Gentlemen, welcome. We'll proceed to questions at once, and the first series will come from Richard Snyder.
Bruce, what kinds of ethical standards already exist in the medical profession? Aren't there things like institutional review boards? And certainly there are people in bioethics. You're with us. What's the background of this?
Well, let me take the bioethics first. This is a fairly new racket. 10 years. Bioethics has been seen as a discipline, and most of that time it's had a struggle to convince science that it wasn't out to do what the church did to Galileo, that it isn't out to repress science or get you to change your results, and so on. Once that's established, the various bioethics groups try to take the kind of issues we'll be talking about here today, for example, the DNA replication, and spin out, mostly in what we call research, but really often are bull sessions, spin out the possibilities. You bring together theologians and philosophers and lawyers and consumer people and so on. What could happen if something went wrong? What are the ramifications of this new technology? What decisions does it require of us? To my knowledge, there are about, about 13 organizations doing this. the National Center, which I had and which publishes a newsletter, is the only one aimed specifically at lay people. We're not so much out to change scientists' attitude as to tell lay people to start discussing these things and to get in on the talk. It's too important to leave to professionals.
If I may, a part two to that question, if bioethics is new, who has traditionally made these decisions?
Well, the decisions are new, Duke, in many cases, not always. Traditionally, if you had an ethical decision in medicine in the United States, the physician made it. He may have told the family that they were making it, but there was always, now if I were in your position, and so on. I don't blame the physicians for this. We've demanded this of them. But that's been traditionally the situation. And when physicians studied what they called ethics, it was really what's now called professional ethics. My brother in med school had a half-hour lecture in 4 years of med school, and it was mostly about how big a sign you could put out in front of your office. Now we moved beyond that and beyond fee splitting and that kind of thing to the area of really ethical issues. That is, the shoulds and oughts that spring up in not only in the practice of medicine, but in the use of the new medical technology in the labs and so on.
Bob Murray.
I think you've pointed out that a lot of times maybe we want to work through a group, but I think after hearing you, you're saying the decision many times becomes down to people. How do we help people know how to make a decision rather than being one of these groups, radical for no better word? How do we get communication to people? This is a problem. I mean, I see it in the classroom, but how do I do it without showing my bias?
Yes.
Who do I turn to?
It's a good question, and one of the first things to point out is that we really shouldn't have to ask it. A civilization that's progressed this far ought to have valued the ability to make right and wrong decisions enough that it would be a basic part of our whole educational system. And I'm not talking about telling kids what they ought to believe, but equipping them to make right and wrong decisions, equipping them to make the ethics or morals decisions that they can live with, that are best for them. Obviously, I don't believe in an overall answer for every ethical question. That's why I say it that way. Well, how do you do it? We need to start way back with the long-range things, and certainly change our educational system and our attitude toward equipping kids to do this. And certainly it has to be done even before junior high.
But don't we oftentimes hide behind the group that speaks for us, is what I'm trying to say. A lot of people find the group and say, all right, I believe in this, but they don't really believe in this. They support a group that has told them.
That's
I find that hard.
Often true. In the bioethical issues, it's more often that people don't even know the question is there. Amniocentesis, prenatal diagnosis of a birth defect, is very widely practiced. It's done here in Coeur d'Alene and in medical centers across the country, but I think the majority of women in the United States don't know about it. Probably a little less than half. So that's the first thing. Second, those decisions, that kind of decision, the bioethics decision, has tended not to be made so much by a group as by the professionals involved. We did a survey that found that 40% of obstetricians were not telling women that amniocentesis was available, prenatal diagnosis, and this was women who might be at risk for having a child with a birth defect, older women, women with a genetic disease in the family. We pressed it with another survey, and a shallow one, the response came back, we're worried about the risk. And we did an in-depth survey and found that it was these doctors did not believe in abortion, and therefore were withholding from the women, regardless of what the women felt about abortion, And abortion is not a thing I've come here to discuss, but that's an example of who's been making the decision. It's been the professionals. And one of the scary things is that people are already talking about having a bioethicist in each hospital. Okay, I don't want that. I believe firmly that the masses, however you want to describe them, people like you and me, can make decisions about our own lives if the information is given to us. And part of that is our responsibility, and part of that is the responsibility of the professionals to get the word to us. These decisions need to be made. This is what you need to know to make the decision.
Father Wasmuth.
Well, in a whole lot of these areas, though, you're dealing with very, very complicated kinds of information, aren't you? And yet you're asking people to be prepared to make decisions in a lot of these areas at a time when they're perhaps the least emotionally able to. I'm not arguing against you with it. I'm just wondering if maybe we don't have a complicated set of knowledge, facts that's moving, a whole area that's moving very, very rapidly, more rapidly than even a professional could perhaps keep up with all the different dimensions. And at the same time, they apply to some very day-by-day, realistic, ordinary people decisions. How do you separate those two?
Well, I'm convinced it can be done. In the first place, a lot of things racing through my head. One of them is that, unfortunately, the complexity of it is one of the excuses physicians have used for not informing patients or their next of kin. This is far too hard for them to understand, therefore I'll make the decision. Or they'll say the family is distraught, therefore I'll make the decision. I question the therefore. The family is distraught, therefore I'll be just as supportive as possible to them in making their decision. The family doesn't know enough, therefore I will see that they get to know enough. I know of hospitals, for example, where there are now social workers who spend a good bit of their time in the genetics area informing the families to do this. What do you need to know? You don't need to know what a zygote is or a lot of these fancy long-handled biology words to know that the fetus your spouse is carrying is going to live for a year, the last 6 months of which it'll be a vegetable. You can say, the doctor can say it in those words, and he can say that's what's going to happen because the new tests, fortunately or unfortunately, tell us that clearly. Now, what does the family need to know? They need to know how they feel about ending the pregnancy, how important it is to them to be for or against abortion. They need to know whether they'll have support in dealing with the pain and anguish that we put on people who have a genetically affected child. You know, we put a lot of stigma on such people. They need to know some things like that, but they don't need a biology degree. And they don't need to know most of the complexities. My own feeling is, and I'm biased, but my own feeling is that the reason we blow up the complexity is because we really don't trust those folks to make their own decisions. That may be unfair, but that's my feeling on it then.
If you've joined our program in progress, our guest today is Mr. Bruce Hilton. He'll be with us again next week. We have started today a 6-week series on the question of DNA research, and particularly we're discussing genetic engineering. Mr. Hilton is the director of the National Center for Bioethics. Mr. Hilton, before we go back to the panel, I would like to ask a question. I think we're already halfway through the program, and we have so much to cover this week and next week. I think our viewers at this point must be beginning to perceive in their minds that they'd like to know more about what we're talking about, that we have to apply the ethics to. Could you give us some ideas of what's going on in DNA research that has to do with bacteria and so forth, and how it may be used in society, and both the benefits or the dangers that may occur from that?
Sure. The information, of course, has just exploded in the area of gene splitting, recombinant DNA, whatever you want to call it, which basically is a procedure for changing the genetic makeup of an organism. And without going into all of the details of it, we can make a bacterium, for example, think that it's part of the human pancreas and start reproducing other bacteria that will make insulin. Or bacteria will learn to eat oil, so you can eat up oil spills. Bacteria can be changed so that a plant can fix nitrogen out of the air, as soybeans do, so you don't need to fertilize anymore. The ethical issues involved here are several. One, is there a real danger to humankind from one of these bacteria, being a diseased bacteria that's created in the lab, getting out of the lab, like in the Andromeda syndrome, and spreading like wildfire as a disease for which humankind has no resistance at all because it never existed before? And to protect that, they're doing things like creating very special labs with airlocks and with a negative air pressure inside so that the air flows in rather than out, and so on. Another fear is that we may be short-circuiting evolution. That is, there's a certain amount of crossing over of genes from one species to the other, but we're now crossing genes over in ways that never would have happened. And what's this doing in the long run? We know what happens when we introduce an Agent Orange or PCBs. We find out 20 years too late that the PCBs that are in all the transformers cause cancer. What could happen? We know that some of these changed bacteria have created cancer in mice. But looking at the larger picture for generations unborn, what are we doing? That's another ethical issue. A third ethical issue is who's going to get wealthy off of this? Because we're talking about hundreds, in the long run, hundreds of billions of dollars. I heard a man who's the head of one of the DNA labs say that his company was interested only in markets there would be more than $1 billion a year, and that he could get a significant part of. Well, he's investigating 50 areas like that. The research was done at universities at public expense. Then these professors trot over and start their own little companies and sell stock. One man's stock went from $500 to $66 million overnight when Genentech went public. That, for me, is an ethical issue as well. That gives you some idea of how rapidly. As you know, Tony, it used to be that you had 30 years from a brand new scientific discovery until it affected the man and woman in the street, until in applied technology. Now it could well be days, literally days.
Richard Snyder.
Well, I heard you mention a bacteria that eats oil, and it seems to me before I could be in favor of dumping bacteria that eat oil on oil spills, I would want some guarantees about what that bacteria is going to eat when it finishes up the oil. And I think I get a little scared when I read about this, and I have done some reading in genetic engineering, because my information is that overwhelmingly genetic engineering capabilities lie in private enterprise. And I don't want to sound like I'm anti-capitalist, but I know enough about economics that any corporation with outstanding common stock is going to make economic decisions, that is, decisions based on where profit is at, as free enterprise does work that way. And that scares me, because I see genetic engineering as something that affects us personally, socially, that decisions that might be made today on the basis of make money might be terribly destructive 5 years down the road, 20 years down the road. Are there, in effect, ethical standards to constrain private enterprise from basing their decisions solely on a profit motive?
Well, I could be cynical and say no, because they don't seem to be working. But let me say I share all of your fears, Richard. One of the things that's operating is that the current federal standards apply only to those labs that got federal grants. And there's intensive lobbying to do away with those as well. but they don't affect, as you implied, the big commercial labs. And the commercial labs gave lip service to safety rules. For example, there's a certain size. You don't mess with more of this stuff than a certain number of liters. But Genentech just one day announced that they felt too constrained by that and weren't going to do it anymore. There's nothing anybody could do. Some of the senators, including ex-Senator Church, tried to introduce some laws that would apply this to the commercial labs, were quickly gunned down. And so I share that fear. Not only the fear that safety will be violated, but in the search for money for the stockholders, but also the fear that the direction of the research will be determined by what really makes money, rather than where there might be some significant needs.
Have you any information or inclinations as to how the Reagan administration might behave in terms of getting big government off the backs of genetic engineering companies, for instance?
Well, I do think it's predictable, and some friends in Washington do tell me that they're much more likely to give in to the pressure from scientists both on the campus and off to get off their backs. Now, this scares me because even with these strict regulations, there have been a number of violations publicly acknowledged of the strict NIH laws. Those laws have been loosened twice now, made easier to deal with. And a number of people who still think they're too restrictive go overseas, to labs overseas, and work over there too.
Bob Mary.
Don't you think we still come down to the issue that technology is going to determine what we can do, and society should be determining what we will do? And so our option is with ethics is not with you with the big company, but it's with you and I, because we will ultimately decide, I would hope, what's really going to be done. I'm
enough of a believer in the political process, although I've been discouraged by it at times recently. I'm enough of a believer in the political process to think we also have a responsibility to deal with the safety factor, the long-term ecological factor. I think the last people to leave that with are the stockholders and the people who are responsible to them. That's my own bias. But boy, when you see some things that have been done by, for example, the pharmaceutical firms in less spectacular areas, totally irresponsible things for the sake of the dollar. And then you realize that that we're venturing in an unknown, like we're driving at night with our headlights turned off. Full speed ahead. I am frightened, and I think, yes, we must take individual responsibility, but we have a corporate or political responsibility, and we'd better inform ourselves and get in there on that.
Father Wassmuth.
Doesn't that society, corporate responsibility generally fall behind the speed with which technology is moving?
Yes.
Right? It seems to me the oughts always come a little bit later.
You're right.
Than what we can do with it. We discuss now whether we should have dropped the bomb on World War II, etc. I guess I feel that it's back to Dick's question a little bit earlier, that there should be more strength perhaps put in some kinds of groups of people now that can be formulating some controls, restraints, whatever that might be, or pushes in the right area, which we might need also. Because all of this has, we talk about the fears is what we're spending some time on, but all of it has great potential too.
Terrific,
and
wonderful potential.
Unfortunately, in our world, those things that have the greatest potential always have the greatest possibility for destruction too. Society has a responsibility to protect, and society has a responsibility and obligation to protect those who can't protect themselves. I can't protect myself against a huge corporation that is going to make millions of dollars and producing something that might be harmful to me. I can't do that alone. We have to do that as a society.
We have to do that together.
So I would support what you were talking about earlier in terms of our responsibility to know individually to make decisions that affect us individually. I guess I'd like to have you talk a little bit more about what we can do to make decisions as part of the body politic, as part of the group, besides just being informed. Where else do we go with that?
I guess I've been avoiding saying get involved because it's such a cliche and people seem less and less to be doing it. But let me for a second say why I think this is so important. You would think that science would help protect us. But one of the ironies of the whole DNA research thing is that the scientists have become much more concerned about protecting their own prerogatives than they are about the potential dangers of the DNA. And of course there's some bad history in the past of science being distorted by outside pressures. But what's happened is that the scientists first called a moratorium. They were really scared. They said, let's not do this research until we can set up guidelines. They called a special national conference, unprecedented, did have a moratorium, unprecedented, and set up some good guidelines. But because they did that, the public got concerned, began to make itself felt. It actually did. And I think that's good. Unfortunately, scientists saw that as a terrible threat, began pulling back, set up a media blitz to say, we overestimated the danger. It doesn't really exist. And stay off our backs. Trust me, Herb. And so we're at that state. I think we proved a couple of things. One, that we can't leave it to the professionals. Two, that they hear us when we yell. And one of the things they heard that frightened them most was just a local city council. The city council of Cambridge, Massachusetts, said, if you're going to build this lab, Harvard University, in the city limits of this city, we want to know what the dangers are. And you will not get a building permit for this lab until we know it. And that city council, I think, was responsible. They spent a year, a subcommittee of it, really studying what they felt needed to be done. And in the end, they gave permission, but under certain circumstances. So there's a very homely, local, graspable thing that people did.
I must interrupt. We're out of time. I want to express our appreciation to the panel. Ladies and gentlemen, our guest has been Mr. Bruce Hilton, who is the director of National Center for Bioethics in San Francisco. I'm happy to report that he'll be with us again next week when we'll continue to discuss this very important topic of DNA research and genetic engineering. Today we've attempted to lay the groundwork dealing with the ethical questions and who should be in charge of deciding what will or will not be done in research and how it affects the human race. I assure you next week that we'll be very detailed in discussing some specific research such as test tube babies and human cloning and so forth. Following that week, we'll have 2 weeks on public policy concerning this question and 2 weeks with the scientist that deals with the specifics of what's going on in the lab. I want to express my appreciation to the Regional Campus Ministry Board for their funding and helping us with this program. Please be with us again next week. I am Tony Stewart. Have a good week.
The North Idaho College Public Forum can be seen at this same time each week over this station. This production was videotaped earlier by a North Idaho College student crew for viewing at this more appropriate time. Campus of North Idaho College and today's broadcast of the North Idaho College Public Forum. The crew is comprised of North Idaho College television students. Your moderator is North Idaho College political scientist Tony Stewart.
Welcome to part 2 of a 6-part series on the question of DNA research and genetic engineering in particular. Last week and this week we're dealing with the ethical considerations of this research. The next 2 weeks we'll deal with the public policy questions and what laws we should have, and the last 2 weeks we will deal with the scientists dealing with the lab techniques or what's going on in the research. Coming back to our program for the second week is Mr. Bruce Hilton, who is the director of the National Center for Bioethics in San Francisco and has held that position since 1973. He is also the editor of a publication called the Bioethics Letter. He has a baccalaureate from Indiana Central University and a master's in divinity from the United Theological Seminary. He's also had experience with those doing this kind of research. For example, he visited Dr. R.G. Edwards in London, the godfather of the first test tube baby, and discussed the ethical question. He's also served as keynote speaker at the World Conference on Human Rights and New Biology. Mr. Hilton, welcome back for a second week.
Thank you, Tony.
With me again this week on the panel are the same three as last week: Richard Snyder of North Idaho College faculty, Bob Murray of the faculty at North Idaho College, and Father Bill Wasmuth with St. Pius Catholic Church. Gentlemen, welcome. We'll start the questions at once, and we're going to deal with some of the specific genetic engineering methods, and we will invite Richard Snyder to start the questioning.
Bruce, in genetic engineering, is the decision really one of the individual and his doctor, the individual and some institution that does do genetic engineering? Can it really be a one-to-one thing where you have a certain disease, Mr. Patient, and we're going to genetically engineer that disease out of you and out of your offspring? Or is it fair to look at this as involving an entire species, where what we do to individuals does affect the offspring and therefore the future generation of that species, whether they're human beings or there's some form of bacteria or plants that take nitrogen out of the air instead of put it back in? Is this really just an individual decision, or is it something that we as a society, and perhaps even a worldwide society, should be deeply concerned about?
Well, you have a way, Duke, of getting right down to the nubbin of the question. I spent a week in Zurich one time with 28 people who spent the whole week arguing which of those is right. We were talking about genetic counseling for genetics decisions, whether to have a child, whether to have prenatal diagnosis when you know you're at risk, and to go ahead and have the child or not. And it was interesting that the physicians there, about 15 of them, said it's absolutely the couple's right. The laboratory geneticists said we must think of generations unborn. And I'm not sure you're ever going to settle that. I can tell you my bias, which is that in these decisions about genetics, we have to be socially responsible, but that the really awful things that have happened because we were thinking more of the society as a whole than of the individual's rights.
Bob Murray.
We keep coming back to amniocentesis and diagnosis before birth, and the word is used so often. Do the people who are asked to make the choice know what's being done for them?
I think by the time they have to make the choice, yes. I think the ignorance is more at the level of people who might be at risk to have a genetically affected child who don't know that they even have the choice. But to get to your question, once a couple knows about this procedure, then they have to decide, is it relevant for us, for example? There are only a certain number of diseases that can be detected early enough in the womb for a safe abortion. And so you limit it to that. Then they have to make a decision, well, should we have the test and have the chromosomes looked at in the fetal cells, but do it without making up our mind whether or not we'll have an abortion? Because one of the ethical issues is that a lot of doctors won't give the test unless you say beforehand that you'll have the abortion. My experience is that people know, however, enough to make the decision.
But is abortion the only option? I mean, abortion or defective child? Aren't there other things that can be done besides those two choices?
I wish I could say yes, but at this stage, basically, because, as you know, the birth defect is represented in every cell of the body, or the inherited disease is in every cell of the body. There's no, quote, cure for it. We can do things like give special diets to kids born with certain inherited diseases. We can put glasses on people with myopia. We can give insulin to diabetics. But they'll always be diabetics. They'll always be nearsighted. They'll always be retarded or whatever. Now, I say always in the present state of the technology. And that's an awful choice to have to make, especially I have a lot of sympathy for people for whom abortion is morally unacceptable. It's not my position, but I really feel for them, because here's science saying, here's a wonderful new way that you don't have to have a retarded child, and it's one that you morally cannot accept.
Father Wasserman.
Most of the things around genetic engineering seem to be in the direction of making human life better. I would hope they are anyway. Do you get a feel as you travel around amongst the scientists or amongst the people that you lecture to that works reverse way around, that as genetic engineering is looking to making human life better, these same people that are trying to do that or are considering that or are interested in that, at the same time look upon less than perfect human life with less and less regard? Whether less than perfect human life is somebody with myopic vision or diabetes, or less than perfect life is somebody with Down syndrome. Is there a point at which we are, no matter how we're going about it or what we're calling it, that we're still building a super race and everybody that doesn't fit into that is somehow going to be looked askance at?
That's one of the crucial questions underlying all of this discussion of genetic engineering. I'm not sure, to answer your question, I'm not sure how, because I don't know whether there's more of this now or whether we just have the technology to do it faster now. Because my feeling about Western culture is that part of our grand religion, with a little r, is the belief in a super race. I always get questions about it after my lectures, you know, how are we going to weed out bad genes and so on. We really believe this, and it pops up again and again in the field of eugenics. Beautiful genes. We had an awful example in the United States in the 20s when scientists, going on the best knowledge they had, went and lobbied Congress to pass a bill to keep people from Southern Europe out of the United States because they were convinced that their genes were not as good. And a lot of us don't remember, those of us who grew up with that act. It cut the number of Greeks who could come into the country from 63,000 a year to 600. All on the basis of the science of genetics. Now we know that it was hogwash, and also did terrible things to human beings. I guess what I'm saying is, yeah, you gave me a soapbox to say we really got to be careful that we think about the racist implications of genetic engineering, the human rights implications of genetic engineering. We have to think about what is normal and who's going to decide what's normal. And we have to think about those who are outside the quote norm, and whether they are valuable human beings as well.
Mr. Hilton, you've brought up in your lecture today several genetic engineering techniques, and the most glamorous and the one that gets the most publicity is human cloning. I was very impressed with your discussion today of, first of all, how would this work technically, and what are some of the ethical questions that arise from that? Would there be anything beneficial, or is it all negative? What could possibly come from that?
Well, I'm a little cynical about cloning. It is the Ferret Fawcett majors of bioethics issues and of genetic engineering, but it'll probably be with us, not nearly as swiftly as people think. Basically, as you know, in cloning, you take out the nucleus of a fertilized human egg, the nucleus that contains those 46 chromosomes that are its inheritance by chance from its parents. Take that out and replace it with the nucleus taken from a known human being. And thus the hope is that that identical inheritance would be passed on, same as that of the donor. The only good thing that I've heard so far that might come from it, a bioethicist who had just had a child, they said, if our youngster should be stricken with a terrible disease and die, and it would devastate us, I can see cloning that youngster to have another who was just like him, because we love him. The dangers, however, if and when cloning comes with us, are, I think, more, the misuses certainly are more easy to spell out. One is that some people talk, for example, about cloning 5 identical twins so that you can do a clear, controlled, double-blind study of some scientific procedure. Because you've got identical people and you could raise them in an identical environment. Somebody pushes that further and says, let's create assembly line workers. A lot of people don't enjoy assembly line work, but if they were a little less smart, they wouldn't raise the question. So we'll create a race of drones to work for the rest of us. I think that the green factor, or the greed factor, is what's going to bring us cloning. That is, if people will spend $6 million for a horse race, for a racehorse, they'll probably spend something like that to set up a scientist off in a corner of North Idaho College campus to clone a racehorse, because breeding of horses is really a Russian roulette business. You spend a lot of money with little chance of getting a winner. But if you could clone a secretariat and know that it started life with the exact same genes, you'd be well ahead of the game. Then the question is, will we then move on to human sports and clone a Mickey Mantle or a Kareem Abdul-Jabbar and start negotiating for his contract at birth, so on?
So the ramifications are very extensive. Ladies and gentlemen, if you've joined our program in progress, our guest is Bruce Hilton, who's the director of the National Center for Bioethics in San Francisco. Last week and this week we're discussing the ethical questions that arise from genetic engineering and types of DNA research. We shall continue the questioning with Richard Snyder.
Bruce, I'd like to go off in a slightly different direction for a moment. Something just occurred to me, and it's maybe a little bit of a bombshell, maybe not, but I'm dying to know your response to it. Surrogate mothers. The idea that a woman, often for a fixed fee, I've heard the figure $10,000 mentioned, lends her body to have a fertilized egg from another man and woman implanted in her womb, and she allows the child to develop there, gives birth to it, and the child is given back to the other couple. From an ethical point of view, how does that differ from prostitution?
That is a bombshell, isn't it?
I'm going from the point of view that she, in fact, is selling the services of her body.
Well, I guess if you push that too far, we're all selling the services of our body, are we not?
Yeah, but I wasn't. I think there might be a closer tie. Maybe yes, maybe no. I don't know.
I'm in a spot partially because I consider prostitution a victimless crime, and that usually the prostitute herself is the victim by the way she's treated by those who exploit her. But I think it is possible that the fact that you can use surrogate mothers with in vitro fertilization or test tube fertilization could be misused, and that I guess I'm more concerned that certain women will be exploited. There are enough ways to exploit women in this sexist society as it is. But that women, for example, a young woman who desperately wants to go to college and has no other way to do it except that a couple come to her and offer her the scholarship. That's an offer she can't turn down. I have a bunch of these little clippings from classified ads from the San Francisco papers, incidentally, if you think this is science fiction. Childless professional couple seeks young lady to bear their baby through artificial insemination. This is an earlier procedure. All expenses paid plus EXCL compensation. Excellent compensation. That's here. And one of the worst I've seen came out just last week in a San Francisco paper. The couple said, we want a surrogate mother to bear our baby. This should be a woman who would like to have a girl, because if it's a girl, she can keep it. If it's a boy, under the contract, we'll take it.
May I just follow that up with one other thing? You said a prostitute perhaps is a victim of her own.
Mm-hmm.
Why not a surrogate mother?
I guess
Is it
what I'm
possible
saying, yeah,
for a woman to have a zygote, a fertilized egg, implanted in her, to carry that offspring for 9 months and give birth and walk away without at least some kind of emotional pain? Do you have any experience in this? Not that it's happened to you, but I mean, do you know of...
No, what I do know, and this kind of surprises me, is that, as you know, there's a guy in Detroit whose profession is getting surrogate mothers together with childless couples. He says the best surrogate mothers and the most frequent ones are married women who've already had a child. And the motivation seems to be, he says, that they'd like to help somebody else. Now, I don't think that rules out what you're asking. I'm convinced that this will be a way of exploiting some women, and that people who are economically vulnerable but who have their health are going to get exploited this way, and I think that's too bad.
Bob Mary.
How about, following the same line though, how about people who look at this as a marketable skill?
Yeah, well, there I'm caught by my insistence on the person's right to make her own decision. I'd have to say that.
Yeah, I've read an article just recently on a lady who considers that a marketable skill.
It's a
that
marketable
she thinks
skill.
she should be able to use.
However, in society we do sometimes have rules that keep people from doing dumb things to themselves. And I'm not ready to say on this, but I think it's an excellent question. I think your question points out what's true in so much of genetic engineering and the other bioethical issues, which is we haven't even begun to deal with that, and yet that's a question we must answer individually and as a society.
Father Wasserman.
Bruce, in your experience, you have a master's degree in divinity, and I'm sure in these whole ethical questions that you run into churches a lot. What's been your feelings in terms of churches and genetic engineering, and what would you say it should be? What should churches be doing? What should church people be doing in relation to this question?
That's a tough one, because first of all, you get into a church like mine, which is the United Methodist Church. You've got the whole spectrum. Second, because some churches are doing lobbying and public opinion making that I think is just horrendous because it's in the wrong direction. While I approve those people who are lobbying and public opinion making in the directions that I agree with. It's a very tough question. I think there's no question that churches ought to be doing a lot more educating in the field of genetic engineering. Pastors are counseling young couples without the least reference to the fact that many of these couples now are going to be faced, because of the new technology, with decisions, prenatal diagnosis decisions and so on. And that's not part of seminary training yet. So education, certainly from the pulpit and in church school and so on, people ought to be being prepared to make decisions. Now, where we get in hot water, obviously, is where the church has a specific philosophy that presses on one of these genetic engineering things, a feeling about right to life or abortion or about experimentation, about human freedom, so on. So I know of one area of genetic engineering where the Unitarians are dead set against it, and another area of genetic engineering where it's the Roman Catholics who are dead set against it. It's pretty hard to put an umbrella over that.
Richard Snyder.
Bruce, what about test tube babies? A, what are test tube babies? B, don't I recall a big incident out of England a couple of years ago, year and a half ago, somewhere? I know time goes, it may be longer than that. What went on? What's it all about, and what are the ethical questions involved?
Well, as you know, they're not really test tube babies, they're Petri dish babies. The human egg is taken from a woman by inserting a needle into her abdomen, drawn out from the ovary. The human egg is then fertilized with the husband's sperm in a proper culture medium and allowed to divide and redivide, as it would do if it were fertilized in the lower end of her fallopian tube in the normal way. They started to do this because they wanted to know just scientifically what happens, but they've recently been doing it because a lot of women have their fallopian tubes blocked and can't become pregnant. So they fertilize the egg and then implant it up the birth canal into the womb and expect it to fasten to the wall of the womb and grow normally. One of the problems is, this thing which takes place by the millions around the world every week, they haven't still found a foolproof way to do it. There are 3 to 5 babies who've been fertilized this way. The question is because one man claims to have produced 2 that he won't write a scientific article about. And as you know, in science, if it's not written down, it's not true. But I spent some time with R.G. Edwards in Cambridge, England, and also on a committee with him in Switzerland, talking about the ethical issues here. Basically, the issues that people raise are, 1, this isn't natural, and to many people, procreation that is not natural is objectionable. And I don't think it'll ever replace the natural way, but that's an objection for some people. Second, some people believe that's a human being the moment that it's fertilized. A lot of people believe that. And if you believe that and you draw out 3 eggs and fertilize them and select one, what are you going to do with the others? To flush them down the drain? Is that murder if they're human beings? How do you get informed consent from that human being for this experiment? A human has a right, and so on. And then the following area, well, one thing that people have suggested is that most of us really don't have an inheritance worth passing on. We've got this myopia or some inherited disease of minor things. We're too short to fit the Aryan model and so on. So now that we can do in vitro fertilization, test tube fertilization, couples who have been judged by the government to be unsatisfactory should go down to the sperm and ova bank, select sperm from a model donor that's modeled to them, what they're looking for, and an ovum from a mother that's a model for them, have it fertilized in the Petri dish, implanted then in the wife's womb, and they'll have a child that at least is physically theirs, if not genetically. That's obviously an ethical issue. There are others, but the one that interests me most, I think, has to do with the surrogate mothers, the possibility of exploitation. I wouldn't have any trouble with having a child by, say, a sister-in-law, my wife and I, our sperm and ova, if my wife were physically unable because of health to have one. I think that could be a moral thing to do. But what if it's because my wife and I like to be out discoing every night and we don't want an interruption in our social life, and we can afford it? Now, granted, lots of people don't have that option, but we're rich enough to do that. Do it. Is that a moral act? I'm not ready to say.
Bob Murray.
Can we draw a line here between, say, 2 individuals who serve as their own donors for sperm and egg, and somebody who decides they don't even want to be their own donors? They want a donor egg, donor sperm, and then what happens in a community where we have the same donors for egg and sperm all the time? What happens here?
That, incidentally, that's happening already with artificial insemination, as you know, because doctors tend to go to the same donor, and those who are in a relatively small community. One reason they go to the same donor, incidentally, is that they have a bias about what's an ideal donor, and it usually tends to be a medical school student. But if you have 50 people in an area where of pretty much the same social class and who know the same doctor and who are half brothers or half sisters of each other, then That question is certainly a real one to ask. You could well end up marrying your half-sister, and the AMA has raised questions about the kind of record keeping that doctors now do who perform artificial insemination. Said you better keep track of.
Wouldn't this sort of the same thing end up with male prostitution also? The male needs the money to complete his medical school, and this is one way to get his money.
That's a possibility. Certainly there are a number of people who make money for school by producing sperm.
About 1 minute, Father Wadsmith.
Well, I can't give him a soapbox question. I just think that maybe our nation, people of the nation, and certainly in this area too, are pulling away from being as concerned about large issues, social issues, more concerned about surviving themselves. I personally think that's unethical. You want to comment on that?
No, I couldn't agree more. And incidentally, any question you give me is a soapbox question in this field.
Not with only a minute, though.
But I think that's certainly true. The one thing we can do, I think, is catch people where they are interested, which is their own individual involvement in it, and build from there.
With that, we have to bring our program to conclusion. I express appreciation to you, Mr. Hilton, for being here. It's been a very informative 2 weeks, and thank you for being on the show.
Thank you, Tony.
And my thanks to the panel. Ladies and gentlemen, our guest has been Mr. Bruce Hilton, the director of the National Center for Bioethics. For 2 weeks, we've been talking about genetic engineering and the ethical questions that arise from that research. I hope you'll be with us again for the next 2 weeks when we'll discuss with Dr. Robert Blank, the chairman of the Department of Political Science at the University of Idaho, the public policy questions concerning genetic engineering, to be followed by 2 weeks with Dr. Klein from UCLA on the research itself. These are very, very important topics, and I'm sure you will receive much information. Please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
The North Idaho College Public Forum can be seen at this same time each week over this station. This production was videotaped earlier by a North Idaho College student crew for viewing at this more appropriate time.